2022 meets 2025. I'm Aida Rahmattalabi, a research scientist at the ethics team at Sony AI. And I'm very excited to be here today with our four amazing panelists to discuss problems around AI safety. I'm going to start with a little bit of context about what we're going to talk about specifically. As most of you know, there have been a lot of discussions around AI risk or safety, both in the short term and long term. And while some folks warn about the existential threats of AI and the long-term risks, some others may find it as a distraction from the pressing problems that are present in the digital technologies that we see. In this panel, we are going to dig a little bit more into these concerns and hear from our panelists basically what comes to their minds about when we talk about AI safety, both in short term and long term, and what possibly these groups have in common, whether or not they see each other eye to eye. And I'm going to ask our panelists a few questions, but then at the end, I will turn to the audience to get their questions. So please note down any questions you may have in the comment section. So before jumping into the questions, I would like to make sure that our audience get a better sense of our panelists and their background. So one by one, I'm going to ask our panelists to give a very brief introductions about themselves and their work. I will start with Kat Jennings.
Awesome. Hi, guys. My name's Kat. I don't know why I look fluorescent red in this lighting, but we're just going to go with it. So I found my passion for AI and machine learning ethics as an undergrad at NYU while studying philosophy and mathematics there. And right now I work in venture capital, where I invest in pre-seed and seed stage hard tech companies, many of which, of course, incorporate AI and machine learning capabilities. So that's been a really exciting crossover for me there. I'm also currently studying at Oxford University. I'm in a master's program where I get to specialize in AI and ML ethics, as well as a few other things as well. Specifically right now focusing on the impacts on the Western judicial system. So that's been really exciting, such as the potential for AI judges in the future and what's going on right now, things like that, short term and a bit of long term. And I also study just war theory as well, which also has some interesting overlap with autonomous weaponry.
Great, thank you. Next, I'm going to turn to Ravit Dotan.
Hi. So my name is Ravit. I guess found my passion, as Kat said, for AI ethics when I was doing my PhD in philosophy at Berkeley. And now I'm doing a number of different things, thinking about how especially startups and investors can increase their AI responsibility. And as a part of that, I am also VP of Responsible AI at Mission Control. And that is the first time I introduced myself in this way. So excited for this panel.
Thank you. Emilia Javorsky.
Yes, thank you. So I'm Emilia Javorsky. I work with the Future of Life Institute across a range of AI issues, mainly focused on risks and safety around AI, but also a bit on how do we steer AI for positive upside as well. And my area of work actually overlaps a bit with Kat's in that over the past few years, I've been leading our work on lethal autonomous weapons.
Thank you. Olivia Gambelin.
Thanks. I'm Olivia. I'm a bit in the dark. I'm actually calling in from Brussels. So if you see me yawning, I'm very sorry. I've had a lot of coffee today, but it's a little too late to have another one. So I am an AI ethicist by training. So my background's in ethics and morality, specifically applied to artificial intelligence and ML. I am also the founder and CEO of Ethical Intelligence. We are an ethics as a service provider. What that means is we provide ethics boards to small and medium businesses. And yeah, that's about it.
Thank you. So I'm going to start by asking a question that I kind of alluded to in the introduction of this panel, and that is, we see that there are basically two main views on AI safety. One that advocates for addressing the imminent risks of AI, such as privacy, discrimination, bias, while another group tends to look a little further ahead, for example, by warning about conscious AI or general purpose AI. There's actually a recent debate online about Google's dialogue model, and the engineer who was in charge of testing that, who claimed that the model had become sentient. I want to know I want to hear from each of you, where do you stand on this? And do you believe that focusing on these long-term risks is a distraction from the actual problems that we see, or no, these are legit concerns that we need to seriously discuss? Or maybe even a third view that you may have and I didn't talk about. And I want to start by asking Ravit, would you tell us a little bit more about your thoughts?
Yeah, okay. I like that I'm going first. Okay. Yeah, okay, the question is, what do I think about this? What is sometimes called the near-term, long-term divide? And yeah, I think I'm of the opinion that I don't think that's the right way to frame the difference between them. I think the name is a bit misleading, and also misleading kind of in favor of what is called the long-term camp, because I think it's not about short-term or long-term. And I liked, Ada, how you kind of, even, when you framed it at the beginning, I think maybe it's more accurate to talk about the kind of issues that the camps have in mind. So one, I think what is called the long-term camp, indeed, they're talking about, general purpose intelligence and those kind of things, whereas the other camp is talking about fairness, accountability, those kinds of issues. And I find that this is a better characterization of them of the camps, because I think sometimes the long-term camp doesn't see the long-term implications of bias and things like that. Because as I understand their argument, we should be thinking about those risks in the long term, because even though chances are really small that, humanity is going to be exterminated by AI, we should still think about it, because the consequences can be that devastating. And I think if we're looking at that long term and small chances, like the same argument holds for like what happens if bias goes wild, right? Could we maybe get into like a nuclear war that could like destroy the world? So if we're looking at small chances at the very far future, those kind of consequences can still happen with the risks that involves transparency, accountability, fairness, those kind of things. So I think it's not really about short or long term. And I think this whole framing is a bit of a distraction and kind of at the heart of the dispute itself. I think it's really about which kinds of risks we care more about, but not because of the long or short term or how many people will die.
Got it. Thank you. From what I hear from you, one thing that was very interesting for me was that basically there quote unquote short-term risks that we care about, but then when we look at them in the long term, they're long-term risks, so they're not really separated. They can't be separated. There are risks that are just the continuation of these short-term risks, and maybe this is not a good there's not a distinction. But I would like to also hear from other panelists. Emilia, what do you think?
Surely. So I also reject the near-term, long-term framing. I don't think that's particularly helpful. And perhaps the way that I would think about it, having worked on issues that are on both sides of this. So the work we do on lethal autonomous weapons is very squarely aligned with thinking around bias of algorithms and risks of artificial intelligence and like the here and now and today, but also working in an organization that does care quite a bit about safety and ethics of sort of more powerful AI systems. And so I think the way that I would frame it is more thinking towards the generality of these systems and the power of the systems that we're talking about. And we heard a bit about that in the previous panel of systems that are increasingly powerful and more general purpose, that the scale and the types of risks that they introduce are somewhat novel, but also I don't think entirely unrelated to what is quote unquote short term. And so I think that many of sort of the risks we think about in AI safety and ethics have similar analogs and similar thinking, whether you're looking through the short term or the long term framing. So when we think about things like interpretability and explainability, when we think about fairness in the context of short term, more narrow systems, and that looks more like value alignment when we look at more sort of complex and generalized systems. We can think about privacy and we can think about data rights, right, as we look towards sort of more longer term systems. So I actually don't see these as like adversarial camps. I see them as actually like a lot to learn from both of these, and that there's like should be a much more sort of robust cooperation and collaboration between these two communities, because at the heart of it, we're thinking about very similar things, just in different levels of generality of the systems.
I like that you said these are not really adversarial, and we have to learn from either types of risks to mitigate the problem. But I would like to also hear from Olivia, as your role as an advisor for ethical AI practices. How do you think about risk? Do you see this distinction when you're advising different firms?
Yeah. So I guess I'll also give a roundabout answer of I don't really agree with these camps either. So that whole point being, if I were to go by those definitions that we had laid out versus short-termism versus long-termism, I would naturally classify myself in the short-term camp, only because I'm very focused on solving the problems that companies are currently tackling. We're not tackling whether or not AI is sentient. It's not. Let's just stop it there. And let's focus on the fact that what about emotion AI, where machines are trying to read human emotions when machines aren't even capable of emotion? That is a real problem. That is a real dilemma that we're facing. That to me is much more important, but I don't classify that as short term. I see that much more on the long term, where it's looking into the future of who are we as humans, where are we developing alongside our technology, where is this going to go? So yeah, I think I'll just sit in the middle like everyone else here and say that they're not really at odds with each other, but it's definitely looking at short term, what are the problems that we're facing now, and how are we fixing those in a way that doesn't create further problems for us in the long term? So it's both at the same time.
I like how you're all in agreement about this, but let's also hear from Kat. But I want to maybe dig a little bit into this problem and see if, from your perspective, do you see, first of all, what do you think about this? Do you think there's a dichotomy or no? If not, what relation do you see? Do you see if there are any commonalities between these two? Any relation?
Oh, wouldn't it be cool if I picked a camp and I was so different to anybody else? But I'm just going to agree with everyone else, because I think in connecting the two, Aida, because the short-term concerns that are happening now, if left unchecked, are going to be used to build and then effectively be built into the future machines. They're kind of inescapable. So, for example, in certain jurisdictions in Western systems, in both the US and UK, machine learning tools are currently being used to make liberty-defining decisions regarding whether an individual should be released or retained in custody pending trial. So the real key there is that it's important to stress that no one has been tried or convicted of a crime yet, and machine learning tools are therefore being able to use their characteristics, their personal history, and comparing those to historical criminal data, matching that description and case to make a decision about whether or not they get to be free on bail or whether or not they're retained in custody. So no prizes there for those who can think of the kind of issues arriving there, especially in the US around historical crime data. And then if you cut to China, where machines are being used in a courtroom as part of a transition towards smart justice, or Estonia, where in small claims courts, AI judges are solo making decisions on those claims, essentially anything worth, I think it's 7,000 euros or less. So these things are already happening. The short-term concerns are becoming the long-term concerns right now, live in front of us. So how the future looks, or what rather the long-term camp's going to have to deal with, depends very, very heavily on what the short-term camp does now. And how they're advised and what steps they take to clean up their act, essentially. So whether or not the long-term people will have a great framework to go off of, or will have a lot of cleanup to do.
I see. So I think there's also another side of another side to this story, and that is maybe the public's perception of AI risk. And specifically, I wanted to hear your thoughts on the public's AI literacy and how that affects AI safety, or how we go about it. A study by Allen Institute for AI suggested that about 84% of Americans are AI illiterate. And this is a study that was, I believe, done about a year ago. So I wanted to ask you, I'm going to turn to Olivia for this question, and others, please feel free to jump in afterwards. You, I believe, as in your role, you do also a lot of training with firms about ethical principles. So I want to see if there are any lessons learned from that space that maybe we can use and generalize to the population, the rest of the population, and whether you see this trainings as something necessary as we want to have, as we try to approach a more safe, develop safer AI systems.
So I guess when my company's working with firms on any type of training, we're focused on ethics training, but I can speak a little bit to the wider public lack of understanding of AI. That's where a lot of the fear and mistrust is coming into play that we see, because we don't understand what we don't know. And quite often when someone asks, hey, can you explain this algorithm? Can you explain the system to me? You get the answer of, it's math you won't understand. That's a bunch of fill in explicit words. If you can't explain your system, you don't understand your system. And so we need to start to create this culture where you have to sit down and be able to explain your system to someone that doesn't come from a mathematics background, but comes from a completely different background, or say doesn't have that same literacy. When working within firms, within companies themselves, it's interesting to see the different departments and how they play off of each other. We do have to break through that barrier when, say, we're working with a risk and compliance team or a legal team and their data science department, and we're trying to bridge some type of miscommunication that's happening between the two. Quite often it's because the system itself is misunderstood by the departments outside of, say, the data science department or the programming department that's been building that system. So it is absolutely crucial that people can understand the technology. And it's really not that complex. You can boil it down. You can use metaphors. You can use stories. People understand that. We don't have to know the code to be able to know the machine.
I see. Yes. So it was interesting that you mentioned the consequence of this AI low literacy, because that may lead to either over-trusting these models or not trusting them enough to really participate. And we know that we want diverse views, data from diverse populations to have more robust systems, of course. So I want to also hear from Ravit. What do you think about AI literacy? And would this be part of the risk of AI that we need to address or not?
Yeah, unfortunately, I'm going to have to agree. I think it's going to be one of those questions. But maybe just taking a slightly different route to the same conclusion that AI literacy is crucial. I think sometimes, AI is technology, it's new technology. So sometimes I think it's easy to miss analogies to things that we already know. And so I think in every other domain that's relevant to, the public really needs to know the basics to be able to voice their opinion, their criticism. Sometimes, when you think of the Dutch scandal with the childcare benefit, this was it was a government, like the government fell because of this. So this has to do a lot with our political selves and our political lives. And we already know that when it comes to those things, we do need to have basic literacy of what is going on. And I think AI is just no different. It's a new kind of technology that enters our lives in a very meaningful way. And if we as citizens are to be able to, I don't know, engage, we gotta know what we're dealing with. Like, not in detail. We don't need all the technicalities, but we need to know the basics. We need to understand.
Yeah, thank you. So I want to go back to a point that was made earlier, I think by Emilia, when you talked about the scale of these AI systems. And so instead of thinking about short-term versus long-term, we want to talk about scale. And since you are working on global governance of autonomous weapons, I think this is one of the areas that has definitely a bigger scale. It can have very big consequences. So I wanted to hear from you about how we now in these domains with such a big scale, how do you approach AI risk, especially because there's a lot of uncertainty as well about these consequences.
Yeah, I would say, sort of on the question of general purpose systems and scale of systems, I think that I completely agree with what other panelists have said. There's sort of two categories of risks that I would think about, which is the aggregated risk of getting wrong all the things we are getting wrong today with narrow AI, and having that add up over time and get amplified as we go to increasingly powerful systems. And then there's also another category of risk that's just intrinsic to general purpose systems. And so I think there's sort of a two-pronged approach of how do we get these near-term or sort of issues of today with narrow systems right and solved, and also how do we start to tackle, especially given the accelerating rate that we're seeing. Anyone that's been watching the media and large language models has been seeing, like, we've been getting more and more powerful faster and faster. And so it's kind of that two-pronged parallel path approach. And I think when we think about, there's the technical side of that, but then there's also the governance side of it. And so that's what we've thought a lot about with our work on autonomous weapon systems, is both the risks that these systems pose in and of themselves, but also the governance precedent that sets. So are we actually, as a global community, going to allow software to decide who lives and who dies and make that decision? And so where are we going to start to draw red lines around, like, use cases of AI that we're comfortable with and use cases that we're not comfortable with, and setting those examples now, because those will be the examples that are the substrate of thinking and governance and policy making as we get to more powerful and powerful systems, or other questions that we have to deal with, like Kat's work at AI in the justice system, and how do we think about that? And so how can our community really work together to start setting the right precedents at this point in time? And so for us, the autonomous weapons conversation, both in terms of the risks that those systems pose to stability and security, but as well as the ethical precedent that those systems pose, is something that we've been working very hard to address, with working with states, with working with the United Nations on this, with working with the Secretary General, with the groups in Geneva, to really get this clear red line that, as we think as a global community, how are we going to use AI in the world? Well, if we're going to let software decide who lives and who dies, it's going to be really hard for us to navigate the more complex and sophisticated policy decisions that are ahead. So for us, that's a pretty big one.
Interesting. So I'm curious to hear what have been the responses in all of these interactions. Do you see an acceptance of these AI risks?
Yeah, so in terms of literacy, a big portion of our education and outreach work has just been getting people to converge around what are we talking about and understanding what is this? This is not the Terminator, right? Why is it not the Terminator? What is it that we're actually talking about with integration of algorithms into weapon systems? There was a big educational piece of this. And I think in really the past few years, we've started to see an understanding, a common understanding and sort of convergence around some architectures of thinking about the policy of this. So the International Committee of the Red Cross, who's really sort of the custodians of the law of war, released a policy position that pretty clearly states systems that are designed or used to target people should be prohibited, and also systems with a high degree of unpredictability should be prohibited. And while that is quite vague, it's a starting point for people to start to understand and have a common conversation under where we start to draw these lines. And we've definitely seen the number of states adopting that type of thinking picking up. So I would say there's signs of progress on this, but as with anything in new technologies, there's a long sort of education phase that needs to happen to reach a common understanding about what we should do about it. And unfortunately, technology is currently moving a lot faster than that conversation. And so that's kind of for us why it's an all hands on deck scenario.
Yeah, definitely. That is super important. And it's great to see that these conversations are happening. I wanted to also turn to Kat because I know you and Emilia have work on similar in similar areas, and I wanted to see where do you draw a line between science fiction killer robots and the real risks that are really imminent or in medium term, long term are we are faced with.
Yeah, I think, if one believes that general AI, superintelligence, etc., is inevitable, I'm sure one would think that there are some things that the long-term risk camp would have to strategize for that the short-term risk camp would not, just because, of course, the short-term camp does not typically concern themselves with what would happen to the world and the future of the human race, etc., should machines reach and eventually exceed human intellect. But I think in terms of short-term strategies, I think Emilia put it really beautifully when she was talking about convergence. I think there's a lot to be gained by different sets of people with different skill sets putting their heads together to form legal governing bodies to oversee certain processes. So, for example, in the case of the use of deep learning in the criminal courtroom, the private developers building these machine learning tools could be required to be transparent enough about the underlying code such that it can be subject to independent critical evaluation by a legal governing body. Otherwise, we're essentially allowing those private developers with perhaps no legal experience or credence, or maybe they do, but just in this example, to make major decisions that could dramatically affect whether an individual is deprived of their liberty without challenge or review. So I think combining that convergence with the knowledge from different fields and knowledge bases is a good approach to take for at least short-term strategy.
I see. Thank you. So following up on that, in terms of strategies for addressing AI risk, in recent years, there has been a lot of work, of course, both on the regulation side and the companies themselves coming up with different ethical AI principles, and even some advocating for human-centered AI. I wanted to hear from you to all of you. Maybe I will start by Olivia. What strategies are out there that you can think about, and which ones do you use in your day-to-day job when advising different firms, and maybe how do they differ? These strategies differ based on the scale of problem that we are talking about.
Yeah. So I think in my unique cases, I work with companies in discovering the challenges that they face in terms of both AI risk and also potential innovation. One of the things that we focus on at Ethical Intelligence is using ethics actually as a tool for innovation. So the complement to risk and innovation at the same time. And there's a lot of different techniques, I have to say. Our main strategy is actually just breaking down and trying to find, is this a challenge that is being faced on the people level? So we're looking at the culture. Is this a cultural problem where discussions aren't happening, where employees don't feel like they can voice any challenges that they're facing around ethics, that there's not a common lingo shared among the company? Is this something that sits more in process? Are they missing a framework? Are they missing a workflow? I've seen plenty of data science teams try and implement fairness to no avail solely because they did not have a workflow and they were applying it in all different places and all different metrics. And so even just a simple workflow changed the entire face of their fairness initiative. Or is this a challenge that sits within the technology? And then that's where we start to get into questions about what I like to call the more existential questions, but you're really looking at the feature design, you're looking at the development of the systems themselves. So there are a lot of different strategies that sit within this. So I know this is kind of a non-answer, but there's a lot of strategies that sit within all of these. What my company does is we take the strategy of actually supplying ethics boards where you're bringing in the expertise to help find and navigate these problems ad hoc as they arise. So that's one strategy, and lots of places that you can find and apply other strategies.
I see. Thank you so much. So I wanted to give a big apologies to our audience and panelists. I didn't realize that we have another panelist here. I'm so sorry for this mistake. But now I want, since we have time, I want to take this time to ask Sean McGregor to introduce himself, and also please jump in the discussion. I'm very sorry.
We almost made it. I was trying to do my best active listening, and we almost had an all-women panel, and I came in and ruined it at the end here.
I'm very sorry.
No, it's all good. Yeah. So Sean McGregor, I'm here today representing the AI Incident Database and the organization we founded to build it, the Responsible AI Collaborative. I don't think, frankly, I needed to add too much to the discussion throughout. You were all doing great covering, and needed nothing from me. And yeah, so that's me. Happy to be joining and being the most active listener possible.
Yep, thank you so much. So if you may jump into my last question, which was about strategies on fixing or mitigating AI risk and how that differs based on the scale or the type of problem that you're facing. It would be great to hear from you.
Sure. I think the initial problem that we had in a lot of the AI space is the absence of imagination, where we really didn't think about what could go wrong. And as time goes by, we see more and more cases, more incidents that really take away that as an excuse. And that as we come to experience the world with these systems that we're building them, need to learn from that. And that's a big part of the AI Incident Database, and why we're doing what we're doing is, ideally we could prevent bad things from happening the first time, but we can work very hard as a community to know when bad things have happened and make sure it doesn't happen a second time, or at the very least that we do everything we can to mitigate the negative effects thereof. And so I think we are at the moment where we are beginning to not need a sense of imagination, and we do have the training instances for proper ethics that we can produce our ethical model in which to operate.
I see. But where do you think we are in practice at the moment? I mean, in terms of actually implementing these strategies?
We are in its infancy. So I got my start.
I don't have an answer for that. Is there something else?
Sorry.
I'll log that as an incident. We're in its infancy. I kind of got my start in early 2000s in the environmental movement, more so than in the AI ethics movement, which at that point didn't exist. And I've rather quickly transitioned in grad school towards the ethical implications of the technology I was building in a machine learning PhD program. And I like comparing to the environmental movement and to say, we didn't used to have a concept for conservation, for environmentalism. We had to invent all those things. And we invented a lot of those in the living lifetime of people today. And wherever we are now, I can tell you it's nowhere where we need to be and get to. Just look at how much more we need to go in environmentalism as a space. It's an ongoing effort.
See, thank you. So I heard, in our discussions, I also heard from our panelists this idea of innovation and ethics for innovation. But I was curious what you all think about the trade-offs, the trade-offs between the two. If acting ethically would prevent being innovative, and that itself becomes a reason or an incentive for many organizations and companies to not fully adhere to these ethical principles. I'm gonna turn it to Ravit. Thank you.
I like always being first. Then everyone has to agree with me, and I don't have to feel bad about agreeing. Unless this time they disagree. Okay, so it's interesting to me, this debate about AI ethics potentially limiting innovation, because again, I'm thinking in analogy to other fields. Like, are we thinking about those kind of things when we think about medicine? Is bioethics limiting innovation when it comes to, the field of medicine? So, like, if I make it a law, I mean, I hope it is a law that you're not allowed to, like, intentionally create disease. Is it limiting innovation? Yes. But are we bothered by that? No. So I think because like development of AI is kind of like the wild, wild west right now, and we're kind of used to thinking, we could do like whatever we want. I think it's just like a matter of getting used to, like, we're used to some limitations on innovation in other fields, but we're not really seeing them as limitations per se. We're seeing them as making sure we're not destroying ourselves.
That makes sense. Yes. So what about you, Olivia?
So definitely my bread and butter, this usual response. So ethics and innovation are actually go hand in hand. They do not contradict with each other. So innovation is essentially problem solving in a way that is new. It's bringing in new information. It's bringing in a new process. It's bringing in new technique. In one way, you could actually argue bringing in ethics is new to technology and thus innovative by nature. But actually, the application of ethics in technology is setting a higher bar. It's setting a higher standard for our technology that you have to be creative. You have to be innovative to reach. So say, for example, you're issued a challenge and you have a certain technical limitation. Great, you've figured out how to work around that technical limitation, and you've had to be innovative in that process. You had to be creative to solve it. Cool. That's a boring solution because you haven't considered the ethics of it as well. Instead, what you want to be doing is looking at those technical limitations and then the ethical limitations. The technical limitations, you're not going to go and say this is limiting our innovation. No, you're saying this is what I have to innovate around. That's how ethics works as well. Even though ethics isn't hard in the code, ethics is still just as hard set as code. And so you have to be able to innovate and be creative around those limitations. That pushes your level of innovation, that pushes your level of creativity beyond what simply relying on technical limitations will do. So from that perspective, ethics and innovation really go hand in hand.
Interesting. What about you, Kat? Do you agree, or do you have something to add to Olivia's comments?
I agree. Everyone's been crushing it. I'll just add one thing from the venture capital perspective. I have the kind of distinct honor of being able to invest in founders that are committed to ethical thinking, principled thinking, whatever you'd like to call it, on top of breakthrough engineering. So that's something that I'm super passionate about. I could go on a whole different panel about the importance of impact investing. It's so incredibly important. And so from that perspective, innovation absolutely needs ethics. And as Olivia said, I don't think they're separable. I mean, they could be, but they're not for me.
Great, thank you. So I think that's all of the questions that I had for today. I want to thank our amazing panelists, and again, apologies for the mistake that happened. But we will now take questions from the audience. Yeah, please share your questions. Okay, sounds good. So I think we will now, there are no questions from the audience, so we will now take a break until, until the next program, which is Spotlight. Thank you so much for attending this panel. I hope you enjoy the rest of your day.